So, this past week, someone asked me, how do you choose a life verse? Because I mentioned, as we were going through the lucky 13 scriptures, that I've picked out really because they were the most practical 13 for me in my life in the past decades, because I'm old. And by the way, I am Jerry Rothhauser. This is Spiritual Rants. And so I am ranting about things that are spiritual. And what I have been ranting about is what I feel are the most practical 13 verses in the entire Bible. And I thought that would help people, so we've been going through them. So I did mention a couple podcasts ago the concept of a life verse. So if you haven't heard about that before, now you get to hear about it, and it's pretty important. So in my case, when I was first, I can't say when I was first saved, when I was first aware that I had been saved and was entering into a more deep phase with God, which I would call sanctification. Anyway, I started memorizing the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. So that's probably not a normal thing for people to do. So that's why I say I was entering into a deeper phase with God. Now, you don't have to memorize the Sermon on the Mount, but it will be a blessing to you if you do. Now, what I would recommend, though, that I also did about that time was started memorizing 60 key verses that you could find in a packet by the Navigators, which is basically a college campus group, but I think they minister beyond that age group. But they put out a thing called the Topical Memory System. I call it the Tropical Memory System because I do things like that. The Topical Memory System. So you can go online and get that and start memorizing those 60 scriptures. And if you do that, you will probably know more than your pastor. All right, I'm exaggerating a little bit. You will understand all of your pastor's sermons. And you will understand them really well if you memorize those 60 scriptures because they're key. Now, we're back to the concept of a life scripture. So when I was memorizing the Sermon on the Mount, I got to chapter 6, obviously, and toward the end, there is a verse there, and it just clobbered me over the head. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. In fact, maybe I had read that somewhere before I got that far in the Sermon on the Mount, but anyway, I did get there. And that really is probably the overriding scripture for my life since that time in 1971. Is that even possible? Yeah, it is. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. So between me and the Lord, it's a very private thing between you and he. And I felt like that was really important. And I measured my life and centered it on that scripture. And that is what a life verse can do for you. It helps to center you and helps you connect in a close way to the Lord and enhances your relationship with Him. Obviously, seeking first His kingdom can be an important thing, and His righteousness, seeking that could be an important thing, right? And that could be a guide for you, and then all these things will be added to you. So it helps you get your priorities right, or it helped me, because before that was a good solid paragraph where the Lord promises basics to us in life. Material things, in fact. So you could read through that paragraph, read that verse, but it clobbered me over the head. Later on, probably about 10 years later, I came across Zephaniah 3:17. The Lord your God is in your midst, a victorious warrior. He will exult over you with joy. He will quiet you in his love. I put you in there because it's implied. He will rejoice over you with shouts of joy. So that's New American Standard Version. I memorized it in the NIV because that was the version I was using at the time. And that clobbered me over the head. God was with me. He was victorious. He would help me with my joy. He will quiet me. That was important because actually at that time, someone nicknamed me Hurricane Jerry. So I needed to be quieted. Probably still do. And the Lord would rejoice over me with shouts of joy. Maybe that would be a good verse for you, but it was great for me. All right, we flash forward to, 2005, about 13 years ago. And I found out that I was going to have severe heart surgery done. It turned out it was 6 bypasses, 6 of them. And I didn't believe it because I was only in my 50s and that couldn't be possible. The doctors must have messed it up. I still have my doubts, but I did have the surgery. But in between the tests that they ran on me, and they didn't really hardly have to run any tests because I would walk down the hallway and have feelings in my chest, and they said, no, we don't even have to put you on a treadmill. We have to probe further. So they did, and then came to the conclusion they needed to do bypasses. Well, in between, after I had just been walking down the hall and back, and they thought I needed to be checked out further with a surgery, I went home. Not only did I go home, but they were so serious about it, they said, you have to sign a piece of paper if you're going to check yourself out, because we can't just let you go after the symptoms you had. So I signed on the dotted line and went home. And of course, I started praying. That can rev up your prayer life, right? So I opened my Bible and started reading. And what did I find? Psalm 71, verses 20 and 21. You have shown me many troubles and distresses, probably causing the heart condition, and will revive me again, and will bring me up from the depths of the earth. May you increase my greatness and turn to comfort me again. Now, the NIV says, you will increase my greatness. So it's stated as a fact, and that's the way I memorized it. But, of course, it clobbered me over the head. And it kind of raised itself off the page. So I don't know if you've had that kind of an experience before with the scripture. I probably had less than a handful, maybe 3, experiences like that. So this one was really important that God was trying to impress me with, and I got the message. And so I memorized it, and I went back to the hospital and had 6 bypasses. So that is a way to realize what may be a good scripture for you. Now, my wife, she was saved in church when she was very young, before she was a teenager. And the scripture that she chose as her life scripture was and is Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for calamity, to give you a future and a hope. Now that's a promise for Israel, but if God says it applies to you, you can apply it to yourself. In fact, any scripture that's a promise in scripture, you can apply to yourself and trust God for it. And so that has been important for her entire life. And in fact, we don't pay a lot, usually, for any individual things. But I did fork out for, it's beyond a plaque, it's a framed version of that scripture, and it's really nice, and I paid a little more for it, and it hangs in our bedroom as a reminder of that scripture and my wife trusting the Lord for that. So, to sum up, how can you find your life scripture? Well, read a lot of scripture. Read some, even devotional books, theology. Read those kinds of things that have scripture in them. Or I'm going to include the Lucky 13 in the notes on this podcast. I hope I can squeeze them in because iTunes doesn't give me much room if you're downloading off iTunes. But Libsyn certainly does. And I don't know if it even shows up on Google Play or YouTube. But you get the idea. I will list those 13 and you could take a look at them. If I can squeeze them in, there's a few that are honorable mention. But it doesn't have to be one of these scriptures that I'm putting in the notes. I mean, it's between you and God. And that's important that it's between you and God. But one factor would be if you find a scripture that you really, really like. That's probably the most overriding factor in finding a life verse. Have you fallen in love with that particular verse? Or a couple of verses, or whatever it is for you. That's how you do it. So there you go. And I promised we would continue on positive scriptures. And I have in mind some really great ones for next week. So this is Jerry Rothhauser. This is Spiritual Rants. And I hope you will continue to download.